Using print line statements to create an HTML file is extremely tedious. Java Servlet Pages, or JSPs, are files that merge HTML with special tags that allow you to access Java files and write Java-like code. Here's an example of a JSP file. You can see the HTML in it, but you also see special JSP tags. In the case given here, they're accessing a Java bean called person bean. If you don't know what a Java bean is, here's a very brief description. A Java bean is just a Java class that adheres to 3 rules. First, all fields have to have getter and setter methods. Second, the class must have a no-argument constructor. And third, the class must be serializable. And that's pretty much it. So let's go over the special tags in our JSP file. First, there's a JSP:\useBean tag. This indicates that the JSP file is going to use a person bean object that can be referred to as person in future tags. Then there is the JSP:\setProperty tag. This takes all of the parameters that have been passed in the request, regardless of whether it's a GET request or a POST request, and it uses them to set the Java Beans fields. For this to work, the parameter names should be the same as the field names. Finally, there are JSP:\getProperty tags. These use the value of the properties that were stored in the Java Bean fields. One of the fields is named name and the other is named living. And that's a brief glimpse into a JSP file. Here's the response JSP file within the context of the NetBeans IDE. And this is a new application, so this is a different application than the one we were looking at before. Let's take a look at the folder structure of this application. First, notice that the project is called Person Info. By default, that means that the first part of the path to all web pages will start with /personinfo. Next, notice that the JSP files, index.jsp and response.jsp, are in the web pages folder. That means that they are visible just by typing in their appropriate paths. For example, /personinfo/index.jsp will take you to the index.jsp resource. Notice that personbean is a source file under the package person. If you want to know what these folders actually correspond to in the file system, and it is a good idea to know this, click the Files tab, and it will show you the actual directory structure. From this, you can see that the Web Pages folder is a directory called Web, and the Java source files are under source/Java. On the right of the NetBeans IDE is the NetBeans Palette tool. The Palette tool can be useful when you're just starting out with web application development. You can drag and drop the icons in the palette to places in your documents, and NetBeans will insert a code portion that you'll have to complete. In this file, we made use of the useBean tag as well as the set and getBean property tags. These are the 3 files involved in the Person Info application. The file on the top left is index.jsp. The file on the bottom left is response.jsp. And the file to the right is personbean.java. The The index.jsp file is an HTML file that contains a form. In fact, this file does not even have to be a JSP file since it doesn't really contain any special JSP tags. It only contains HTML. The form tag contains attributes name, method, and action. Name is just an identifier you give to the form in case you need to refer to it somewhere else. Method is the HTML request method that this form uses. If you omit this attribute, the request method defaults to GET. In this case, we're telling it to use the POST request method. Finally, the action attribute indicates the resource that you will request. In this case, the resource is the response.jsp file. Now let's look at how these three files work together to store data in and retrieve data from a person being object. First, the index.jsp file has a form that takes two inputs. One is a text string that goes into a variable called name, and the other is either a value of true or false based on a choice from a drop-down menu. And that goes into a variable called living. When the submit button of the form is clicked, the parameters from the form are sent to the response.jsp file. Inside the response.jsp file, the JSP:set property tag uses the parameters from the form to set the fields of a new person being object. Finally, the JSP:get property tag gets the value of those fields and prints them out as text strings. And that's how we can store information from a form in a Java object and retrieve it again later. Before we wrap up this series of videos, I have a couple of questions for you. When I use the form to submit the name Gregory, for example, and the value true for living, the response page will print name:Gregory and living ? True. But what if I don't use the form to get to the response page? What if I simply type the address of the response page, which is /personinfo/response.jsp? What's going to be printed on that page? Or will I get some kind of error message? And a second related question is, what if I type the address of the response page, which is /personinfo/response.jsp, and then I add parameters as if I'm making a GET request instead of a POST request like the form is making here? What will the response page display? Or will there be an error? Please pause the video and see if you can answer these questions. Ready? First, I want to make sure you know what is going on in the top part of this slide. I typed the name Gregory into the entry form. I chose Alive from the drop-down menu, and then I hit the Submit button. The HTML code for the form specified that it should send a POST request. So the URL that appears in the address bar on the response page ends with the resource response.jsp. The URL does not contain any parameters because it's a POST request. It's not a GET request. The parameters are contained in the body of the request. And the body of the request is also known as 5 seconds to tell me another name for the request body starting from now. Okay, the answer is the payload. Okay, request body equals payload. All right, the JSP:"set property tag reads those parameters and puts them into a person bean object. And then the JSP:"get property tag writes those parameters on the web page, giving us the result that you see here. Now, back to our two questions. Suppose you type that exact same URL in the address bar. In fact, if you're already on the page with the URL ending in response.jsp, all you have to do is put the cursor in the address bar and hit return. What is the result going to be? That's the question we're asking. Well, first, let's make sure we know what we did by entering text into the address bar and hitting return. Anytime we enter text into the address bar and hit return, we are submitting an HTML GET request. And since we did not provide any parameters in our HTML GET request, the result contains the value of the fields from a default person bean object. And if you go back and look at the default initial values for the fields of a person bean, you will find that the default value for name is the empty string, and the default value for living is false. And that's exactly what you see reflected here on this page. Now, there's probably one more question I should have asked you, so I'm going to ask it now. Suppose we go back to just after we submitted the form, so that we're back on this page. Okay? And without ever touching anything in the address bar, we simply hit the reload button. Can you guess what happens in that case if I give you 5 seconds starting from now? Okay, the answer is not the same as if you hit enter from inside the address bar, because the reload button remembers that you got there by submitting a form, and it gives you a warning telling you that if you continue, it will resubmit that form. Now, that warning is a good thing because you might be resubmitting a payment to a website, and you probably don't want to submit a payment twice. In this case, it is safe to resubmit the form, and it will give you the same thing as it did when you submitted the form the first time. Okay, now let's look at the last example where we type the response.jsp resource and some parameters into the address bar. Remember that whatever we type into an address bar is treated as a GET request, not a POST request. So the question here can really be rephrased as, does the JSP:"set property tag care whether the parameters are coming from a POST request or a GET request? And the answer is no. So it accepts the parameters regardless of whether they're coming from the payload of a POST request or whether they are appended to the URL in a GET request. And that's it for this series of videos on HTTP with a little bit of servlets and JSP thrown in. In the next series of videos, we're going to take a closer look at the web application architecture, including the model view controller pattern. I'll see you there.